Welcome. This is the Provoke Media podcast. This is our combining social and media strategy series, which explores sort of the new media ecosystem. We're doing this series in partnership with NewsWhip. I'm Arthi Shah, executive editor for Provoke Media, and I'm host for this series. So this is our second episode of the series, and it's all about Twitter. We're looking specifically at the platform and how it's shaped online discourse and the way information travels. To talk about this, we have Brandon Borman, who is Vice President of Global Communications at Twitter, and also NewsWhip's CEO, Paul Quigley. Welcome to the show, Brandon and Paul.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I just I'm going to take this moment to actually plug the first episode, which I'll have a link to in the show notes. There we had the regional director for WHO out of Africa, and that one is a fantastic discussion. So I'd also recommend listening to that as well. So for this discussion, I'm going to start by reading Brandon's pinned tweet as of August 2020. And because I do want to hear the backstory behind why you decided to pin this. So here it is verbatim. Just to make this clear, spokespeople at Twitter don't make enforcement decisions. They aren't involved in the review process. They share the decisions with the public and answer questions. So tell me about the story behind that.
Well, if you remember, there was an election in the United States last year that was a little controversial, and Twitter was at the center of it. And over the summer, we had an incident where I have a member of my team who at one point had worked in Kamala Harris's office when she was the AG in California. And someone in the press got hold of that and decided that that meant he must be the one who's making decisions that they didn't agree with in terms of enforcement against conservative press. And so one, I was trying to step out and say, if you want to blame someone in comms, blame me. I'm the head of comms. But two, and more importantly, what I was really wanting to emphasize is that we have very deliberately built the review process at Twitter so that comms and public policy are not involved in the review. We have totally separate teams on trust and safety policy that make the decisions on have rules been violated. And then they come to us and say, we're taking this action. And then it's up to us to go communicate it publicly. I think there's confusion. I know not every company follows that. I think there are other incidents at other companies where comms or policy have been heavily involved in making those decisions, and that's simply not the case at Twitter. And so that tweet is evergreen. It's useful to me on an almost daily basis. So that's the reason I've got it pinned up there.
So just a follow-up question on that. So, if comms is not, so while comms is not involved in the review process, I'm assuming you all were involved in developing the policy though.
We review policy, but the policy is written by the policy teams, right? We've hired experts who know what they're doing to come in and say, these are the right policies based on how, we want to approach human rights around the world. They're not coming to comms and saying, do you think this policy is going to work for us from a PR perspective, right? They are writing the policies they think are appropriate based on the principles of the company.
Okay, I'm gonna have one. So, but do you feel like comms should be, because comms represent so many stakeholders, right?
Yeah.
That you should be able to stand up, like say, like what if there is a change, for instance, made to privacy, right? Do you think a comms person should be in the room to say, wait, this is not going to go over well with this particular stakeholder?
Yeah, look, what I've always encouraged our team to do, and the role I think I play in policy development, is to come in and be a source of intelligence from the outside, because we work across so many different stakeholder groups, to say, there will be concerns here. Have we thought about this issue? But I don't think that we should be in there saying, hey, this policy is going to generate negative headlines for us, right? As long as we're creating policies that are in line with the principles of the company, the comms team needs to be able to defend that, even when it's going to be unpopular. And I think if nothing else in my time here, I think we've proven that we're happy to make unpopular decisions.
Yeah, and it's probably a moment to reflect on how long, Brandon, you've been there, right? So you've been there for 4 years now.
Yeah, I'm in the beginning of my 4th year. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So you've seen quite a bit in your time. So I want to ask something about kind of some news you all put out yesterday, and I'm going to first ask Brandon, and then Paul, I'm going to get your perspective on this as well. So Brandon, I think yesterday on Twitter's blog, the company called for public input on its approach to world leaders and whether or not the public believes that world leaders should be subject to the same rules as everyone else on Twitter. And I'm curious, apart from the obvious, sort of, why you all decided to get public input, rather than make this policy decision simply from the, the experts that you just cited.
Yeah, so what we've started in the last few years is that when we are enacting new policies, we'll open them up for public commentary before we put them in place, right? I think when the labeling policy we've been using around manipulated media, for instance, when we introduced that policy, we opened it up to public commentary. In the world leaders case, where we don't actually have an official policy, we didn't have the opportunity to do that when we put it in. I think Twitter's somewhat unique in the way that it gets used in statecraft and governing, and we understand how important and sensitive those topics are. And we felt it was the right time to hear from outside experts, from the public, from people who use the service, just to get thoughts and opinions on how we're approaching it today, how we might want to reconsider things going forward. Look, we don't think we have a monopoly on expertise, and we want to get outside opinion and views when we're making significant decisions like this.
So Paul, from your perspective, I'm curious, what kind of response do you think that they're going to get? And also, from what you've seen on your platform, I'm curious around any observations you have around world leaders and their participation on Twitter. And my hypothesis is that in some ways, right, I mean, social networks sort of reward bad behavior, right? I mean, the more rogue and that a politician seems to go, the more they violate the rules, the more kind of traction they seem to get. I mean, you look at like Joe Biden's follower count compared to like, Donald Trump's. So Paul, I'm curious to see what you've seen.
Yeah, well, I think, Twitter is the platform where news and information spreads extremely quickly. And it's where you can go to reach the elite, whether you want to tweak them and provoke a reaction, as perhaps Donald Trump often did, or, we just want to get the word out and know it'll be picked up and distributed by a lot of journalists very quickly. I think like when it comes more widely to the moderation question, there's already been a lot of progress made by Twitter and by Facebook in the last 4 years. That's kind of ignored a little bit. I think the water level of expectations has risen a lot. If you look at 2016 election and our data on what were the most shared stories in the run up to that election, it was almost total Wild West. It was the most engaged URL got the most engagement, and it could have said anything and been anything. And that was the era of the Denver Guardian and the Macedonian teenagers. And I think the platforms have kind of played a role now where, okay, maybe some of the most engaged content is still controversial in its opinion pieces, but it can't be fake news. You can't be full on InfoWars stuff. And, while there's an Overton window of allowable content that's considerably shrank, and you can't put out things that look like news that are fake, unless it's satire or something like that. And I think there's not much credit given for that, because a lot of awareness of this problem has come about at the same time, so it's talked about and criticized a lot more. But it's not the Wild West anymore, certainly. And I think the opening up of discussion about moderation and kind of presenting the problem back to the public is good approach.
So Brandon, so on that note, then, I mean, because if you all are taking this sort of public input, do you think Donald Trump's suspension is truly permanent?
Well, what I can say on Trump's suspension is that the rules that he was suspended under currently do not have the ability to appeal that decision. So from our perspective, the decision's been made.
So I want to go back to something that that Paul just mentioned about what content is acceptable and how that the standard has changed, and it has gotten higher from the 2016 election, where I don't know, Pizzagate may have been acceptable content, where now it's not. But what do you do about the so much misinformation has a kernel of truth in it? And I want to talk about this not just around politics, but also around COVID, because I know you also recently expanded kind of applying labels to misleading information about the COVID vaccines. And as Paul and I have talked about previously, the most effective forms of misinformation are built around a kernel of truth. So what do you do in those situations, and what should communicators think about in those situations when the bigger narrative is blatantly false, but it is built on a foundation that may have a kernel of truth in it?
Yeah, so there's two things I want to hit on here. One is why we chose labeling versus just removing things. And then two is what we've changed in the last 4 years, because it's not just policy, it's things that we can do in the product that are attached to what we've then ultimately done from an enforcement perspective. So a big part of the reason we chose labeling was when we said we were going to start this with manipulated media, right? People who were altering videos or creating deep fakes. And we went out and we said to users of Twitter, and we said to academics and regulators, how do you want us to approach this? This is how we think we should do it. One of the most loud points we got back was, please do not simply tell me something is fake. I don't trust the companies to make this decision. I want you to provide me information so that I can do my own research and make my own mind up. And that's very much how we've been approaching this, right? Is not to slap a label across something and say this story is false, because I think there's a lot of research out there that says actually when companies do that, the opposite happens. People look at that and then want to say, oh, well, now I believe it even more because they're trying to keep this from me. So if you look at how we've approached labeling, it is to point to outside resources, and not just press. I mean, in some cases around the election, for example, we were pointing to press releases from the state election boards that were setting the record straight. And we think that's the role we should play, is to help people get access to additional information so that they can make a more educated decision on how they want, what they want to believe. And that's only possible because in the last 4 years, we've made significant changes to the product that enable us to put those types of labels in, that enable us to put some friction into the system, because ultimately we don't think that the choice should be just, do we leave this content up or do we take it down? Right? There are nuances into how you can enforce, and you make decisions on what you highlight and what you promote, and that's where we think the most effective work from the services can be.
Paul, from your perspective, I mean, what Brandon was saying, that you say something's fake and suddenly there's much more interest in it. Have you seen that play out in your own data?
Yeah, well, there's a phenomenon, I suppose, where if you don't trust the person who's labeling something as fake, you're not going to believe them. You're probably going to entrench your belief. And most misinformation or narrative misinterpretation of facts to suit a crazy narrative, that takes place among groups, and groups who are perhaps motivated to feel suspicious about people who are coming in telling them, no, this is the truth. So I think, and there is research to suggest, people being presented with more context and prompted to reflect on facts can lead them to change their view, whereas being told, no, this thing that you want to be true is not true because we told you so, just doesn't seem to work. And going back to the our discussion with Halim from the WHO, like, I was impressed with how respectful they are. They're like almost epistemologically respectful, like there's things we don't know yet, so right. This is disputed, which is kind of language that Twitter's using today. And I think also when we spoke ourselves at Marshall Manson from Brunswick, he's similarly like, there's some groups that are maybe beyond saving, but then there's a big middle ground here, and you don't want to just get their backs up. So I think it does look like the right approach.
I want to then ask specifically about, one account that I've noticed is just like, really fueling a lot of misinformation, I guess, about vaccines. And I'm just curious, Paul, whether you've seen what kind of traction the Alex Berenson account, right? I mean, and I'm shocked. Like, I mean, and I don't follow that account, but I do go there because I'm just surprised. Like, whenever I see something, I'm like, okay, where did this come from? And I go and I read that. I mean, I'm just curious, like, to hear about like what your take is from like how that information on that site is getting, or on that particular profile is spreading.
This is one for me. That sounds like a fun one.
Yes.
No, like, I mean, so my wife is actually an epidemiologist, and that leads you to a degree of modesty about what you can know, about the world. Like, public health is complex. and you get a lot of different, I suppose, responses to different treatments from across a wide swathe of the population. So I don't know. I think Alex, I follow what he's been saying, and I have no idea how you could contradict someone who is that entrenched and has that much information at their fingertips and is that well read into it. But I don't envy those who need to decide whether these things are disputed or not, because you're looking, I think, at reports of vaccine side effects, but they're coming from the public, so they could be motivated, they could be wrong. But there's so much we don't know. Like if you look at the field of nutrition or a lot of elements of health, they're just, there's a lot of things in dispute that are kind of surprisingly still in dispute as science evolves.
It's almost this it seems to be this classic case of, I mean, some of it is based in a lot of science, in fact, right? But then I think what the zoomed out headline is, that seems to be where a lot of the controversy seems to be, is like, wait, you're getting the wrong takeaway from this information.
And his followers are going to take things he says and run with them, like right past the 50-yard line. I'll try and use an Americanism, but they're gonna take it a lot further then. So it kind of does inspire. There's little nuggets of facts that then inspire potentially crazy narratives, and
So I wanted to make sure we also touch on sort of Twitter and brands. And I know, Brandon, Twitter introduced some conversation settings for advertisers recently that can kind of control who participates in the discussion. And I'm curious to see how that's gone. I mean, does it sort of stymie this organic discussion? Does it actually erode some trust in the conversation as part of the appeal? Seeing the brand believers and then seeing the other side. And I'm just curious sort of to see how that's gone. And then Paul, I would be curious to get your take.
Yeah, look, I think obviously the hope is not that it stymies organic conversation, but that it gives account owners, and look, we've done this for general users as well, right? We think you should have some control. We don't. There's a bigger initiative going on here, which is trying to decentralize more of the content moderation, more of the decision making, so that it's not all sitting in our hands. So you as an individual account owner, as a person, or as a person representing a brand, you should have the ability to decide what kind of conversation you want to have. I think we would caution brands to be careful in how they use those tools. There are extreme cases where they should be used. Using them just to stymie any criticism will probably have an impact on people's trust in the organization as a whole. But there are certainly edge cases where there are things that are just way off the reservation that do not make sense for the conversation of brands trying to take part in, and they should have the ability to take action on that, as any user in Twitter should.
Paul, from your perspective, I mean, do you think that is something wise for brands to deploy, or do you think there is something, appealing about the Wild West nature of non-moderated discussions?
There's some conversations you just probably don't want to have, depending on the brand's identity, and there's certain things that you just may not want to engage in because you can't engage with everything. And I think there's people who might want to drag you into conversations about everything, and it may end up being pretty lose-lose. Again, it's kind of like Marshall Manson from Brunswick Group's, forest fire analogy, that you got to just sometimes let some bits burn. And maybe those are the places where you're not wading in and commenting and enabling discussion on your social channels that might turn nasty.
The other piece that I saw was, that, brands can have more control around kind of the adjacent content for when they do a promoted tweet. And but I think when on Twitter's blog around that, I think you had also shown that the research shows that adjacency between an ad and divisive content really doesn't affect the brand's favorability. And I would, to me, that actually makes sense, given that most people know how advertising works in that regard. But I'm curious if either of you have seen anything different, or seen instances where maybe brands do need to be careful about, or they need to be aware of sort of what the adjacent content around their conversations are, or their ads.
Yeah, I think brands are naturally cautious about that, and I think it is. It's not even always just what's the tweet your ad appears next to. Sometimes it's what's the overall conversation on the service. I think we saw a lot of hesitation in the first half of 2020 because of how controversial the political world was in the United States, I think as the Black Lives Matter protests really kicked into high gear, that was a very significant part of the conversation on Twitter in the United States, and brands were cautious about participating in it, and understandably, I think companies want to be very careful and thoughtful about how they approach those things. So I think, again, it's about providing brands a little bit more control, because one of the things I think we've really helped companies understand is there's multiple Twitters in any day. The dominant conversation may be about politics, but at the same time, there's a very active conversation going on around basketball, around K-pop, and those are the conversations you want to participate in. So here are more tools to help you be more targeted in the conversations your ads appear in.
Right.
I think there's brands will just get pulled into a lot of places they may not want to get pulled into these days. It's in the nature of being in the public sphere in the social media era. And, an example for us is a client who pulled ads from a kind of popular right-wing talk show after the host made remarks about immigrants. And this turned into a kind of a firestorm where there was a strong impulse to reach out and correct the record and say, this is why we're doing this, and these are our values, we want to stand by them. On the other hand, our data would show that firestorm played out very quickly, and it played out in a particular part of the media ecosystem, which again have been a difficult place to reach. So that was the advice there is actually to stay out of it and let it burn out.
So the other question I was going to ask about is Twitter's interplay with other networks, right? I mean, let's take TikTok for instance. I mean, TikTok's been coming up in so many of my conversations with brands lately. I think it was, I'm not going to name the brand because I'm not positive this is who it was, but they were saying that during this pandemic, especially as people reached the end of Hulu and the end of Amazon, they went to TikTok, right? But people don't necessarily need to be on TikTok in order to get and consume TikTok's content, right? I mean, from my perspective, I feel like most of the best TikToks find their way to Twitter anyway. I think, Paul, you and I have talked about, chatter on Reddit that gets memeified and finds its way to Twitter. So Brandon, I'm curious to hear what you've observed from sort of Twitter's interplay with content from other networks.
Yeah, I think you see it across all of the networks, right? I think Twitter ends up being the place public conversation takes place. And so these things may start somewhere else, but eventually they make their way to Twitter, and this is where people really engage in the conversation. You're seeing it even with something like Clubhouse, right? Where you will have big rooms that get capped at 5,000 people, and you're going to have tens of thousands of people on Twitter talking about them. It's the role we play in society. We strongly believe in that role. It's why we're building products like our own voice rooms and spaces, because we think there's a natural connection between people wanting to talk about what people are talking about and then actually participating in the voice conversation themselves. So I think you'll see us doing more and more of that. Not that we're trying to pull everything into Twitter, but we think the role we play is basically to be the public layer conversation of the internet. So it doesn't matter where the content sits. If you want to talk about it, you end up coming to Twitter and having the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, to that point, actually, but before we talk about Twitter second screen, I want to talk about Spaces for just a minute, because one of the observations I've made about Clubhouse, and I've spoken to others about, is it sort of brought the nice back into like internet discussions, right? I mean, it's amazing how when you're hiding behind your keyboard, how vicious people can be, but when you're actually hearing people's voices and their reactions, how much that changes the tenor. And I'm curious if either of you have noticed that as well, and what that means for our digital discourse.
I mean, I'm happy to start from our perspective. I mean, I think, yeah, generally, I think we're finding that people are a little bit more civil when they're hearing someone else's voice. We're cautious. I'm cautious to say that's how this is going to be, because I think as more and more people start using these tools, we don't know what's going to happen entirely. I think we're trying to be cautious. We're trying to apply all of the lessons we've learned from text, but these voice products are new.
Right.
And there will always be somebody who finds a use case that none of us could have ever anticipated. And so it's on us to be able to respond to those things quickly and bring additional tools into the product, change policies where needed. So I think we're approaching this with cautious optimism that the intimacy of voice does change the way you interact with people. And we will see what happens. I think we're hopeful, but we're also realistic. And there is an element of human nature that it doesn't matter how you build a product, you're never going to be able to overcome.
Right. Paul, have you all been? Well, I know these are sort of closed networks, so I know there's not as much you can, glean.
Yeah, like certainly conversation on Clubhouse, until it picks up some digital signature somewhere else. But in fairness, a lot of it does very quickly. Something happens. One of the things about Twitter is things get to Twitter so quickly. It's like in our platform, Twitter is where things break, and if you see any news story, an event that's picking up steam, you see in the graphs the shooting up of engagement on Twitter, and then later you get this big volume of Facebook sharing and chatter about it that comes kind of later. But it's very interesting, as an early warning system and as a place where the conversation starts happening very quickly. Things just get onto Twitter fast. It's really remarkable.
So well, let's talk a little bit more about that then, and how Twitter has really sort of changed or transformed even the relationship between media, right? I think I've told you both, right? When news is, I'll guess give an example of when the ACA repeal was happening. I think that was summer of 2017, right? If you just watch the networks, it looked like, all right, it was happening. They had the votes. And I remember I pulled out my phone and I was like, I can't look at this anymore. So I put it away. And then I started seeing reporters just mentioning that, McCain was in a huddle with Murkowski and Collins, right? And suddenly, this story is something that the reporters don't. There's not enough to file, something on whatever their publication is. But they were just observing who was talking to who on the Senate floor that night, and suddenly that became the story. And so I'm just curious to hear, your perspective around how this, this is just one example. There's been many since then, and probably many before. Of how that sort of transformed the way that news is reported and what we consider newsworthy and how we follow stories.
It's opened up a lot of new realms for journalists, right? Because to your point, not everything rises to the level of, yes, let's publish this. And frankly, even if it does, that takes time. So the ability to provide of the minute observation, I think, has been very important. A lot of journalists, have built their careers on Twitter. They started off in local news or independent, and they got noticed. The New York Times or Washington Post or Wall Street Journal was like, wow, you're doing really great work in this area. Come work for us to do this. I think we're going to continue to see that. I think what we're also seeing with spaces again, there was a reporter at Huffington Post who was writing about the water crisis in Jackson, Mississippi. And he hosted a space where it was just him talking to people living in that city. And it was such a great way to get behind the headlines and to bring out these very personal stories that typically won't make it through the editing process. So we're excited to see how journalists are going to continue to find new ways to use Twitter and to use new ways for the tools we're providing. I think Substack and we obviously purchase review and are moving in the newsletter space as well. I think that will open up a whole other type of journalism, right? Where there's a level of independence you can create as a writer yourself that has not been available in the past. So it'll be very interesting to see how established journalists use this to round out the work they're already doing, and I think we'll see some who continue to decide, I can actually break off and do this on my own and be able to make a living doing it.
Right. Even stories like you look at the ice storm in Houston, right? That's a story that I don't know would have gained the national prominence that it did had it not been for things like Twitter and people sharing these really these personal stories that were just gut wrenching, right? About sitting in their apartments for the 36 hours and seeing icicles form on their ceiling fans. That just feels like a story that there was a time where it would have been much more localized. And it's of course now we're having a conversation about the national grid, not just what can this happen, where can this happen, anywhere. So let's just talk for one moment about Twitter sort of role as a second screen during major events, right? Whether it's an election, whether it's a Super Bowl, whether it's the Golden Globes. It doesn't necessarily have to be something catastrophic that's happening. But Brandon, how do you feel like Twitter's role has evolved there? Because I know it's been used this way for some time. And now it's to the point where most people, as they're watching something, whatever this big event is, whether it was the Grammys on Sunday, they're also following the Twitter conversation as well. And then Paul, I'm just curious to hear kind of how both Twitter's role during these big events, and then how you see Twitter's role in between big events.
Yeah, some of this, I think, is, let's remember and be honest about this. I think it took Twitter a long time to figure out what Twitter is.
Right, yes.
And I think the last 4 years in particular, we really understood that, it's what's happening, right? We are the public conversation. And I think people sometimes say that Twitter is giving people a voice. I don't think that's true. I think what we've done is create a service and a platform through which everybody can share their voice. And if what you have to say is interesting, if what you have to say it can be funny, it can be insightful, it can be touching, other people will notice that and engage in it and want to have those conversations with you. And I think we see that around entertainment events. I think, if anyone is a basketball fan, I highly recommend you get on Twitter and start following NBA Twitter, because the commentary that comes out during these games is amazing. Really, really thoughtful, detailed breakdowns of specific plays, and really funny, hilarious content that makes the games more engaging. I think especially at a time when we can't all be sitting watching the games in person, it brings some element of that back, right? I think for all of us going to any sporting event, part of it is the fun you're having with your friends. And if you can't do that in person, I think a lot of people have found a way to do that on Twitter. And I think we'll continue to serve that role, even post-pandemic.
I think Twitter is an amazing second screen during events, and the wit and the commentary you get there beat a lot of what you get on Saturday Night Live or what anyone on the first screen is saying. So the other thing is it's the second screen thing. Analogy works sometimes, but a lot of issues that are playing out in the public sphere now just jump from screen to screen. Like again, you back at GameStop, you have a Reddit community. Buying a billboard in Times Square, GameStop will go burr. Getting spotted on Twitter, picked up from there by a New York Post journalist. Writing a story on nypost.com gets shared 250,000 times on Facebook. AOC and Ted Cruz duking it out on Twitter. So when they're making their statements and getting involved in a controversy, it's happening there. So you've got it's a fully interactive second screen that's interacting with all of the other screens, and it has a really critical role within all of that. Like everything does kind of pass through Twitter at some point, but it's it's not a what's Heisenberg's, and certainly it's not an unbiased observer. It's right there on the first screen too, very quickly.
So this might be maybe a good place to end on is there you both referenced kind of this wit that we find on Twitter, and there's almost like this tone on Twitter that really seems appropriate for that platform that may not work for others. So as brands themselves try to find their voices right on Twitter, I mean, do you feel like, or have you noticed that they have to, they have a more like, a Wendy's style kind of a reverent tone on Twitter that may not work on another platform, right? I mean, I'm thinking obviously like, LinkedIn is like people, there needs to be more of a limit, I feel like, on LinkedIn, because it's like paragraphs, people. And yeah, so I was just curious about, how would you describe like the conversational tenor of Twitter, and, maybe even compared to other networks, and for folks that counsel brands, like because you don't want to be inauthentic, and you don't want to seem like you're trying that hard, and people can usually see that, but you should also know the style of conversation when you're on a platform, and
I think you have to know the style of conversation, but more importantly, you have to know the style of conversation that's appropriate for your brand.
Yeah,
I think one of the risks, I think everybody shoots for the kind of Wendy's model or
right.
Steakums model,
Yeah.
where what they think they need to do is have their brand handle become viral and be what everybody's talking about. And that's actually not appropriate for some brands. For some brands, being a little bit more serious, being, not throwing your brand into the ring and some more controversial topics is how you should approach it. I think those cases worked for Wendy's. It works for Steakums. It is not going to work for everybody else. So I would caution marketers who are pushing their social teams to say we need to be viral, we need to be like Wendy's, to realize that 9 times out of 10 that is not appropriate.
And actually, I want to ask maybe Paul if your data showed how that Burger King tweet, the women, right? Just, I mean, and that fit, you know, I mean, the tone wasn't like, I mean, that Burger King tends to have that sort of tone, but I mean, I remember when I saw that tweet first, and then of course, you know, I knew there was going to be more because I know this well enough that I'm like, okay, there's going to be there's going to be a punchline here. But my gosh, like that was so interesting to follow, which of course resulted in Burger King deleting the tweet. And so for those listeners who aren't aware, on International Women's Day, Burger King tweeted, "Women belong in the kitchen," and then the thread basically was spotlighting, you know, female chefs, right? But it was not well received, and ultimately they deleted the tweet. Paul, how did you see that tweet? What was its lifespan?
Well, I think there was an attempt to play 3D chess there, and I guess if they deleted the tweet, it didn't work out. I looked at that like we spot these things as they're coming up, and in our company, and we have our own dashboards, and we can kind of see as this plays out. But like it certainly attracted. I think there was a lot of people who just wanted to jump onto that, and they were trying to get across a message that, you know, women are underrepresented in the kitchens generally, or in Burger King. I'm not sure which, and it just did not work out. And there was just a lot of frustration at. I think just leaving that one tweet there, even if more had gotten into the text with that first tweet, it may have been okay. And I saw it firsthand in our own internal Slack before, like, what is this? And so you've got to be careful. And I think trying to impress, like that sounds like possibly trying to impress other marketers. And we do see, because all the other marketers are on Twitter, and you know there's awards.
Yes, yeah.
You want to kind of like, let's start a conversation about X, but you know there's a big Joe public out there, and I think you got to kind of focus on them and try and keep bringing things back to them, unless you're consciously sometimes going for something that will impress your peers on Twitter.
I think that was a case study in reminding people that individual tweets can always be viewed out of context.
Yeah.
And I think they very clearly wanted to be bold and get attention with that first tweet, and they did.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem becomes, you know, not everyone's then going to read the 6 tweets that are below it. So you have to look at each one of them independently and say, is this conveying what I want, or is there danger here that this is going to be sending a message that is not at all what I'm intending?
Yeah. Yes. And I like Paul's, you know, noticing that, you know, sometimes it is to impress each other, right? I mean, marketers like everyone's trying to outwit each other. And it's interesting is when we do our Innovation Saber Awards, right? And there are some campaigns that everyone's heard of, right? And then there were others that clearly they were such a subset that they were talking to. And it never really gained traction outside of that, you know, small group of, whether it's marketers or, you know, whoever it is they're in group. And for some campaigns, that's fine. I guess that's what they were trying to do. But like if you're, you know, a brand like Burger King, you know, it seems foolish to think you can just talk within your, you know, other marketers there. Yeah. Well, this was a great conversation. I always like to end these things with just one open-ended question of, is there anything that I didn't ask about that either of you want to talk about or mention?
I think the only thing I would add is, and I think we feel this very acutely at Twitter, but I think as you look at how things are evolving for companies, there's a real push for organizations, and I shouldn't just say companies, I think it's true of NGOs and government as well, just to be more open, more transparent. I think lack of understanding in how big organizations work and how we make decisions that have impact on the lives of millions of people was a really significant problem. And I think you see that in every study that looks at trust. So I would just encourage, you know, my peers in comms roles to really think about how they need to shift how they approach their jobs. Right? I think if we've traditionally viewed it as we're here to protect and put up a wall. I don't think that works any longer. And whether it's Twitter or another service, I think you have to really start thinking about how you use some of these technologies to open the organization up to the people you're serving in a new and very different way.
I mean, the advent of the screenshot. I mean, we've seen. I mean, I've just seen what happened with Sprinkler this week, right?
Mhm.
I mean, there's just, yeah. I mean, and it's interesting. You were talking about, there are times where brands shouldn't get involved in a conversation, but the risk equation has really shifted, right? It used to be that brands would have to say, that nope, we can't touch that. That's too controversial. And now it's sort of it's shifted to brands saying, if we don't say something right now, that actually could be worse, right? Like if we don't say Black Lives Matter, that will probably hurt us more than just saying that we want to stay quiet. A few weeks ago, we had an event and we actually had somebody from Lenovo on, and they were talking about this discussion they had internally about whether to wade into that discussion, because as a Chinese company, they were worried that they didn't have the credibility to get, to be a loud voice in that discussion. And ultimately they decided that they should step back. But it's so different than a conversation we would have had 10 years ago, where brands would have said, nope, anything social issues related, we're gonna stay out of. And I think Twitter is a big part of, I think, why that risk equation shifted. Paul, any last thoughts from you?
I was thinking, like, almost everything will end up on Twitter. Things might start on Reddit, they may start on TikTok, and if notable, end up on Twitter, but they don't end there either. They'll be picked up by journalists, turned into stories. So I think what I think is, it doesn't begin and end with the tweet. Like, my advice for communicators would be to see this, try and best you can to visualize this full ecosystem, the deep conversation from the nerdy group who really care about your brand on Reddit, the conversation from journalists and politicians who are maybe paying attention to it, or your own brand and the conversation around that on Twitter. And then the engagement with news generally, not just the direct app mentions, but stories about you. How are those being shared? Like, there's forget about 3D chess, it's like 5D chess now, and Twitter is kind of at the center of it, with everything crisscrossing, but in a lot of different dimensions. And to try and stand back and think about that. It's not insurmountable, but it does require a bit of visualization.
And so much changes on Twitter, and also as these new social networks sort of emerge, that this is almost like a conversation we almost need to have like once a quarter or something, right? Just because it's like, if we had this conversation in Q4 of 2020, it would have been very different than it even is today. Well, thank you, Brandon, and thank you, Paul. And this was another episode of Combining Social and Media Strategy, and we will be back soon with part 3.